Imagine you are a painter. You spend your days with brushes, colors, and canvas. You want to be famous for your art. But deep inside, you have a secret. You don't just want to paint the world. You want to move the world. This is the story of Robert Fulton. Most people think he just invented a boat, but he actually invented a way for the whole world to get rich faster. He took a slow, quiet world and turned it into a high-speed engine of money. But before he was a billionaire inventor, he was a starving artist who almost lost everything. The year was 1786. Robert Fulton was a young man from Pennsylvania. He was good at drawing, so he went to London to become a famous painter. He wanted to paint the kings and queens of Europe. But there was a problem. Europe was full of amazing painters, and Robert was just okay. He wasn't making much money. While he was sitting in his cold room in London, he started looking out the window at the canals and rivers. He saw horses pulling heavy boats along the water. It was slow, it was boring, and it was very, very expensive. Robert thought to himself, why are we using horses in the age of machines? He had seen the steam engines made by James Watt. These were giant, huffing, puffing iron monsters that could move heavy things. But at that time, steam engines were only used in mines and factories. Nobody thought they could be put on a boat. People laughed at the idea. They said, "A boat made of heavy iron and fire? It will sink like a stone." But Robert Fulton didn't care about the laughter. He put away his paintbrushes and started drawing gears and boilers. He spent years in France trying to build a submarine for Napoleon Bonaparte. He wanted to build a secret underwater boat that could blow up British ships. Napoleon gave him some money, but the submarine was too slow. People started calling Robert a dreamer and a failure. He was almost broke. But then he met a man named Robert Livingston. Livingston was one of the richest men in America. He was the U.S. minister to France. Livingston saw something in Fulton. He saw a man who wasn't afraid to fail. Together, they made a secret pact. We will build a boat that moves by fire, and we will control all the trade in America. This was the beginning of a monopoly. A monopoly is when only one person is allowed to do a certain business. Livingston had the political power to get the laws changed, and Fulton had the brain to build the machine. They were the perfect team, but they were thousands of miles away from America, and the British spies were everywhere. They had to be careful. If anyone stole their designs, their dream of oceans of gold would be over before it started. Building a steamboat sounds easy today, but in 1800, it was like trying to build a rocket ship to Mars. Robert Fulton had to figure out how to take the power of steam and turn it into a circular motion to move paddles in the water. If the engine was too small, the boat wouldn't move. If the engine was too big, the boat would flip over or explode. Fulton wasn't just a tinkerer. He was a scientist. He built small models and tested them in tanks of water. He calculated the friction of the water against the wood. He was doing big data before computers existed. He ordered a special engine from the Bolton and Watt Company in England. This was a big risk. England didn't want to sell their best technology to Americans. Fulton had to use his charm and his connections to get the engine out of the country. When the engine finally arrived in New York, people gathered at the docks to see it. It looked like a mess of copper pipes and iron bars. They started calling it Fulton's Folly. Folly means a stupid mistake. They thought he was throwing Livingston's money into the river. Fulton worked day and night. He lived on the boat. He slept next to the boiler. He had to make sure the wood was strong enough to hold the vibration of the engine. Think about the noise, the clanking of the metal, the hissing of the steam, and the heat of the fire. It was like living inside a giant tea kettle. But Fulton loved it. He knew that if he could make this work, he would change how every piece of food, every bag of cotton, and every human being moved across the planet. The boat was called the North River Steamboat, but history remembers it as the Clermont. It was 133 feet long and had 2 big paddle wheels on the sides. It didn't have a beautiful shape like a sailing ship. It looked like an unlucky sawmill on a scow. But Fulton didn't care about looks. He cared about power. He knew that the wind was unreliable. Sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it stops. But steam never stops as long as you have fire and water. This was the first time humans were going to tame nature. We weren't waiting for the wind anymore. We were making our own weather. August 17th, 1807. This was the day of judgment. The Clermont was sitting in the Hudson River in New York. A huge crowd had gathered. Some people were laughing, some were betting money that it would explode, and some were just curious. Fulton stood on the deck, looking nervous. He gave the signal to the engineer. The firemen threw wood into the furnace. Black smoke started pouring out of the chimney. The water started to boil. Suddenly, a loud thud-thud-thud sound filled the air. The paddle wheels started to turn. The boat moved. It didn't just move a little bit. It started moving against the wind and against the current of the river. The crowd went silent. They had never seen anything move against the flow of water without someone rowing. People on the shore thought the boat was on fire. They ran away in fear, thinking a sea monster made of iron and smoke was coming to get them. The boat traveled from New York City to Albany. It was a 150-mile trip. Usually, a sailing boat would take 4 days to do this trip, and only if the wind was good. Fulton did it in 32 hours. It was like going from a horse and carriage to a Ferrari. When the boat arrived in Albany, the laughing stopped. Everyone realized that the world had just changed. Robert Fulton was no longer a failed artist. He was the king of the river. Livingston and Fulton immediately started selling tickets. People were lining up to pay for a ride. Why? Because for the first time in history, you could tell someone, "I will be there at 4 p.m." And you would actually be there. Before the steamboat, travel was a gamble. Now it was a schedule. This predictability is what businesses love. If you can predict time, you can predict profit. Fulton started building more boats. He started making money so fast he couldn't even count it. He had created a highway of gold on the water. But with great money comes great enemies. Because Fulton and Livingston had a monopoly from the government, nobody else was allowed to run a steamboat in New York. Other businessmen were angry. They said, "The river belongs to everyone. Why does only one man get to make all the money?" This is where the story gets gritty. Fulton didn't just build boats, he hired lawyers. He spent a huge part of his life in courtrooms, fighting anyone who tried to build a boat like his. He was ruthless. If a competitor started a boat service, Fulton would lower his prices so much that the other guy would go broke. Or he would use his political power to get their boats seized by the police. He wanted to own every drop of water in the state. This made him very rich, but it also made him the most hated man in the business world. He was a pioneer, but he was also a gatekeeper. He was holding back progress so he could keep his pockets full. While he was fighting these wars, he was also trying to build something even crazier, a steam-powered warship. The British Navy was the scariest thing in the world, and Fulton wanted to build a ship that was unsinkable and could shoot giant cannons using steam power. He called it the Fulton the First. It was a floating fortress. But building this beast cost a lot of money and a lot of stress. Fulton was working too hard. He was fighting in courts, building warships, and running his empire all at the same time. His enemies were getting smarter, too. They started finding loopholes in the laws. They realized that if they started their boats in New Jersey and went to New York, the New York monopoly might not count. This led to some of the biggest legal battles in American history. Fulton was trying to guard a secret that was now out in the open. Everyone knew how to build a steamboat now. His oceans of gold were being invaded by thousands of other people who wanted a piece of the pie. In early 1815, Robert Fulton was walking home in the freezing cold. He had been working on his warship and visiting a friend. He caught a very bad cold, which turned into pneumonia. On February 24, 1815, at the age of only 49, the Steamboat King died. The whole city of New York went into mourning. Even his enemies respected him. They knew that without him, America would still be a slow, quiet place of farmers. After he died, the monopoly he fought so hard for finally collapsed. A famous court case called Gibbons versus Ogden happened, and the Supreme Court said, "No one can own the river. The water is for everyone." This was the best thing that ever happened to America. Once the monopoly was gone, thousands of steamboats started appearing on every river: the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri. These boats carried the people who built the West. They carried the cotton, the wheat, and the gold. Think about this. Robert Fulton didn't just invent a boat. He invented the American speed. He proved that technology could conquer nature. Because of him, America became a continental superpower. You could travel from the East Coast to the middle of the country in weeks instead of months. He turned the wild rivers into liquid railroads. He was the man who took the secret of steam and used it to connect a broken new country into a giant empire. Today, when you see a giant cargo ship or a fast ferry, you are seeing the great-great-grandchildren of Fulton's Clermont. He started as a failed artist, but he ended as the man who drew the map of modern trade. His story teaches us that an idea is only folly until it works, and once it works, it becomes a revolution. Robert Fulton may have died young, but his oceans of gold are still flowing today in the world of global business. He showed us that if you can move people faster, you can change history forever.